Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We're coming to you from these United States of America here, right smack dab in the middle of the country, good old Iowa, between the two rivers, Des Moines, the confluence of rivers. A shout out to anyone who, there's multiple things named that, so I'm not doing anything wrong here on air. There's just a lot of confluence of things happening here in the middle of the country. But, for instance, I am the Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives at Mercy College of Health Sciences. You?
In my department, there's a confluence of scholarly topics, those having to do with science, math, English, history. I'm the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the college.
I like that a dean of anything is sort of like the headwaters of many rivers. That makes you sound very poetic. That is made possible through being underwritten by Mercy College of Health Sciences, mchs.edu. This semester's over, right? But I mean, like, you have plenty of work left to do heading into the winter break, at least for our students. And I don't know about you, man. That's a pretty exciting thing to say.
Yeah, this is an exciting time of year. I know this week we did our pinning ceremony with nurses who are graduating. And that's a really cool ceremony, you know, taking place in the cathedral, right, this go around. And so just having that context, but also the nursing pinning is one of those traditions where I think you see the Catholic heritage and legacy of the work of the Sisters of Mercy, and even the symbolism on the pin kind of is a gesture to our Catholic heritage. If you ever want to visit Mercy College and see that, just let Bo and I know. We'd love to give you a tour.
mchs.edu. Today on the show, we also have cool things we're going to talk about. I don't know about you, bud. I think the liturgy is pretty cool. And if you can have a book that's a history of it, but also short and concise, that's also pretty cool too. Let people know who we're going to be talking to here on the show.
Yeah, we'll be talking to Father Uwe Michael Lang. He's an Oratorian in London, so hails from across the pond, but he's written on all sorts of liturgical topics. I'm familiar with his work as a scholar, so he's got like a pretty hefty book on the Mass, but he's condensed some of those insights, and he's recently published a short history of the Roman Mass out by Ignatius Press. I'm excited for this interview. I don't know, Bo, for me, Advent going into Christmas season is a great time to reflect on the liturgy, because I think, like, you know, it's so central, of course, to our celebrations this time of year.
London Oratory. Yeah, I think that's great. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. We have a special guest with us, and I'm going to flip it on over to Bud to introduce him.
Yeah, our guest today is Father Uwe Michael Lang. He's a priest of the Oratory of St. Philip Neri in London and a lecturer in theology at Allen Hall Seminary and St. Mary's University, Twickenham. He's published extensively on liturgical topics. His most recent book is called A Short History of the Roman Mass. It's published by Ignatius Press and can be found wherever books are sold. Father, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Very good to be with you.
Yeah, so to kick off the discussion today, you know, when folks hear the term the Catholic Church, oftentimes I think what comes to mind is the Roman Catholic Church. You know, it's the largest segment of the Catholic body. Of course, it's just one part of that body. So when we talk about the liturgy, there's actually a whole series of branches. You know, we've got the Byzantine Rite, Ruthenian, also, you know, on down the line, Ambrosian, and so on. Father, thinking about specifically the Roman Mass, which is what your book is about, could you kind of put it in context and talk some about what's specifically distinctive about the Roman liturgy, maybe even like in contrast to some of the other rites of the Church?
Well, certainly the Roman Rite is the most widely used in the Catholic Church today, and most people are familiar with it. But there are other rites too. It's important to be aware of that, say the Byzantine Rite, Armenian Rite, just to name two examples. And these historical rites go really back to the great centers of early Christianity of the first centuries of Church's history. So you have in the Eastern Mediterranean, Alexandria, Egypt, Antioch in Syria, and then Constantinople, Byzantium a little later, and in the West, of course, Rome. And the Roman Rite initially was really the rite of the city of Rome and the area immediately around the city, but then spread more and more, was adopted more and more throughout Latin-speaking community. And all the rites have their common origin in the Apostolic tradition, go back to the foundational event of the Last Supper in the case of the Mass. But they developed in distinct linguistic and cultural and artistic ways. So the Alexandrian tradition, for instance, still very much alive in the Coptic rite. Then you have the Antiochian tradition, which had a strong impact on the Byzantine rite, which after the Roman rite is the most widely used rite worldwide. Now, what is the general characteristic of the Roman rite? I suppose it's fair to say there is a certain sobriety about it, a certain Roman characteristic of sobriety and order. Things are done in a linear fashion. There's a sort of linear sequence in the rite, which is quite different to some of the Eastern tradition, where you have just more ritual complexity. There's a lot going on at the same time, and you have that in the historical forms of the Roman rite as well, especially in solemn celebrations, difficult celebrations. But you have that to a greater degree in Eastern traditions, more complexity, more elements of repetition also. So by comparison to that, the Roman rite is more simple and sober. Now, I say by comparison to the historic Eastern liturgical rites, not by comparison to the sort of de-ritualized forms of Christianity we have in the modern world. So that is the point of comparison. But there's a certain, say, element of order, of linearity, which you find in the Roman tradition.
Yeah, and this work that you've published is on the history of the Mass. My own scholarship and writing is with John Henry Newman. And Newman, of course, is this, he's written the most seminal work on development of doctrine. I think this is especially a key idea when we think about the liturgy, because sometimes I think, there are these ideas floating around that earlier is always better. That's kind of a complicated question when we talk about the celebration of the Mass. So the Mass, of course, is rooted in our Lord's celebration of the Last Supper with his apostles, but there have been important developments since that time. Could you talk about some of the history and how we should think about the Mass in relation to the earliest celebrations in the Church and what we know today?
Newman's work on the development of doctrine is extremely important, I think. And at some point in that work, he also includes the development of the liturgy, a development of forms of worship, although he doesn't really elaborate on that very much. And he also uses an image. He says a river is clearest not at the source, but only once the river has sort of passed a certain way, the river's bed has become deeper and broader, and it flows more calmly. So paraphrasing Newman's words here. And in a way, that also applies to the liturgy. Of course, the Mass especially, the Eucharist, has its foundational event in the Last Supper, in the institution of the Eucharist. Now, the Last Supper does not determine the form of the liturgy. Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, wrote on these questions, and he makes an important distinction. He argues that the Last Supper determines the doctrinal content of the Eucharist, but not its liturgical form. That is only developing subsequently. And we don't know a lot about the earliest form of Eucharistic celebrations. We simply have only very few sources, and we would like to know more, but we don't. So historical scholarship, liturgical scholarship has been quite busy in establishing hypotheses, trying to reconstruct these early forms of the Eucharistic celebration. We have to be a bit careful. We have to be quite humble and admit that we really don't know so much about it. We have one quite clear source in the middle of the 2nd century with St. Justin Martyr, who describes kind of ordinary Sunday Eucharist in Rome to outsiders. He writes an apologetic work addressed to the imperial family. And he gives us the basic structure of the Mass, which is still the same, essentially. Has remained the same in the various liturgical traditions. But the sources begin to flow more clearly in the 4th century. After Constantine, when sort of Christianity comes into the open, becomes part of the mainstream of Roman society, and then we also know more about how Christians celebrated the Eucharist and other sacraments and also other liturgical rites.
Yes, Father, this is a great point, because I think sometimes people go, oh, what Catholics are saying is we're sort of doing a new imitation of the Last Supper every time the Eucharist happens. Can you say more about that it provides the doctrine but not the form? I think that's very important.
I agree. This is a very important point. The Eucharist is not a recreation of the Last Supper. The Last Supper was the context, obviously, in which the Eucharist was instituted. It may have been a Passover meal, but there's some doubt about that, actually. Some historians question the chronology of the Passion events and argue that, well, it may not have been actually a proper Passover Seder, and in fact, Pope Benedict agrees with that argument. But that's in a way not that important, because the Last Supper was celebrated in the Passover atmosphere, very close to the Passover at any rate. But the point is, the command "do this in memory of" does not refer to the whole setting of the Passover, but refers to the rite over the broken bread and the poured cup of wine, which Christ just performed in that moment, identifying that broken bread with his body and poured cup of wine with his blood. So that is sort of, as you say, content, the final content of the Last Supper. But the actual liturgical form developed, and in fact, it wasn't there yet. See, the Passover was a yearly observance, only once a year, like our Easter celebration. The Eucharist came to be celebrated almost immediately every Sunday, and then after a while, even every day. So that liturgical form developed was from very early on separated from the sort of meal of the Christian community. And see, especially in the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians, that at that point in Corinth, the sort of ordinary meal of the community where they shared their food was still connected with the celebration of the Lord's Supper, Paul calls it. But that was separated for practical reasons very soon after that period. And so it developed into a liturgical rite. And it developed into a ritual. The people in antiquity were much more used to and lived much more in a ritualized world. For them, ritual was part of their everyday life. We still, of course, have our rituals. We shake hands or greet each other in other ways, and there are the public rituals, sports events, and so on. But otherwise, our world is much less ritualized than antiquity was, and certainly a religious function, a religious celebration, would have been quite clearly ritually ordered, and that applies to the Last Supper as well. A sacred meal that had the character and was understood really as a sacrificial action that made present the sacrifice of the cross.
Yeah, the football team that I support, they recently refused a handshake at the beginning of a game, and the other team and fan base went ballistic. So those rituals remain important, even sort of the ones that we take for granted. Thinking, Father, so we've talked some about the the historical background to the Mass, specifically its rootedness, and you could say like the Judaic background and the Passover and those sorts of ideas in ancient Israel. But as the liturgy develops and as the church spreads throughout the world, it also picks up other cultural elements. And I guess what I have in mind is I grew up in an evangelical Protestant context, and one of the criticisms that I heard about the church is that it's sort of, it could be like syncretistic. It kind of incorporated elements from pagan culture. So there are vestments that are used, as I understand it, even today, or maybe the way that the Roman Rite incorporates incense. Again, that could go back to the temple, but where we're picking up cultural elements around us. Could you talk some about how that process worked? And do you see, I guess I see like potential pros and cons there, where if you're embedded in a culture that's kind of a thin culture or shallow culture, like appropriating some of its elements could, I think, lead to almost like degradations in the liturgy.
It is true that the Church's liturgy, even in the early centuries, did take on some elements of the culture in which the Church found itself, but that was done really only after a period of very careful discernment. Not everything was taken on, but only that which was understood to be in harmony, in agreement with the gospel and with the profession of faith. In the first century, Christians in the Roman Empire were in a difficult situation. I mean, there weren't always persecutions. It wasn't a constant threat of persecution, but Christians found themselves very much in opposition to their surrounding culture and were quite careful to distinguish themselves from it, especially from its religious expression. They really drew the line here. They were happy to take on certain cultural, artistic, also philosophical and literary elements, which they found in harmony with the gospel, but not sort of the religious elements. And then, of course, with Constantine, there is a greater openness, and there is a less defensive position towards the surrounding. And that's then also when the time when incense is introduced. But of course, as you think about incense, it has a very eminent pedigree in the scriptures themselves. It was, of course, used in the Temple of Jerusalem, and it is part of the worship envisioned in the Book of Revelation. So I suppose the Christians found themselves less in sort of total opposition to their surrounding culture. There was a greater openness also towards integrating certain elements they found appropriate, really, for the liturgy. Incense as an expression of our prayer, rising up to God as a symbol of purification, and so on. And in a way, of course, Christianity bears the stamp of the sort of Greco-Roman Eastern Mediterranean culture in which it was born, and to a certain extent that can never be left behind. The Eucharist is celebrated with the staples of Mediterranean culture, i.e. wheat bread and wine mixed with water. That can't be incultured into rice and whatever the staple drink is in other parts of it. There's that connection to its historical origin, which Christianity can never leave behind. And so also sort of the path Christianity went through in these early centuries is not something that can be completely undone without really severing our connection with the church of the early centuries, the church at its origins. So I think careful discernment is what early Christians exercised in this field, and that's should also be our model.
Well, I think that's interesting. I've had the chance to teach great books in Catholic colleges and high schools and things like this, and when you even run up with someone like St. Augustine, who, he really looks at his life and wonders how many of the pagan elements that he clearly was brought up in should he, keep using. He always speaks very rhetorically brilliant about the dangers of rhetoric, for instance. But what I think is interesting here is this question of how are we going to take, the plundering the Egyptians' gold is what a lot of the patristics said. How are we going to take the wisdom of the cultures that we meet and utilize them in enculturation, like the word you said. But on the other hand, always realize that the way that the church is able to be universal is because of the particularity of history and what happened in history in this place, in this time with our Lord Jesus. And why this comes to mind is people will ask me, well, why do you teach like the Iliad and the Odyssey, here in 2024? This is this ancient Greek text. How can that be something that relates to your students? And I go, funny enough, the reason Homer keeps getting read over and over again is it gets to the universal aspects of human nature, but only through being incredibly particular to its time. In some ways, it's its alien nature that allows it, so to speak, the freedom to allow its universality to ring true. And so I think it's interesting in a parallel way, in an analogy, I should say, that what the churches in the Eucharist and through in the Mass going forward shows is the universality that allows enculturated elements like English or, like you're saying, with incense later. It only can have that capacity, that universality, that way to be truly Catholic throughout all the world because of the particularity of the history it, so to speak, embodies. And so when we talk about if there's a seed or core of the Roman Mass, that's always very dangerous language. Bud and I are both converts. We were both in Protestant seminary. You hear that sort of idea about like a seed or a kernel of Christianity. And so I'm very wary of it. But I will say that whatever else happens through the history of the Roman Mass that you show so well is that the kernel is the historical fact, right? The particularity of, like you said, that Mediterranean culture, three of them, three distinct ones, right? Jewish, Greek, and Roman, that come together. And I wonder if that's something that you have seen, is like no matter where, so to speak, the finger lands along this timeline of the development of the Roman Mass, you still see that particularity shine through that allows the universality.
Yeah, that's I think a very pertinent thought, really. It's certainly the case in the history of evangelization, evangelization of northern, Western European people. Christianity is often, I suppose, accused of being a Eurocentric religion, but of course it doesn't have its origins in Europe as such, but in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Jewish, Greek, Roman environment. And there were certainly elements that were very alien to these Germanic peoples when they were converted in, northern and Western Europe, Germany, England, and so on. But it is the particularity of the story that has this universal appeal. I think there's a lot of truth in that idea, and I also agree that it's really quite dangerous to try and reduce the liturgical forms to some sort of essential kernel, essential form, with the idea that everything else can be stripped away. Now, historically, of course, there have been reforms, there have been changes, there has been pruning at some time, there have been corrections that were felt necessary, and then that's quite clear. But we were looking at something that has grown organically over the centuries. That's certainly a concept Pope Benedict liked to use. It's not an easy concept. Certainly not an easy concept to demonstrate historically, but I do believe there is something to that idea that this has grown over a very long period, and it was not sort of systematically constructed in the way an architect and a technician built something. But there is a more organic process, and as any gardener knows, you have to sort of trim a plant or a tree occasionally. You have to cut something off, perhaps, but you must be careful to respect the integrity of the plant or of the tree.
Well, I think that these are very profound points. We're hitting our first break, so we're going to stop there, and we'll come back to talk with Father Lang right after this. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Bud Marr, stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Bud, throwing it back over to you to reintroduce our guest.
Yeah, our guest today is Father Uwe Michael Lang. He's an Oratorian of the Oratory of St. Philip Neri in London. He also teaches, so he teaches at Ellen Hall Seminary and St. Mary's University at Twickenham. I think I'm saying that mostly correct. He's written widely on liturgical topics. I don't know if you remember, Father, I contributed to a book that you edited that was a lot of fun, so thank you for letting me write on Gerard in the liturgy. But his most recent publication, this is his own monograph, is called A Short History of the Roman Mass. It's an excellent, brief historical overview of our liturgy, so I encourage you to find it wherever books are sold. Father, thanks again for being back with us.
Thank you for having me in a show.
Yeah, so your book, as I said, covers a lot of history and kind of like a brief number of pages. It's pretty impressive in that respect. Whenever we talk about the Roman Mass, I think folks say, say if you were to turn on a movie and it had like a depiction of the Mass, you might see monks chanting in a monastery. I think even of like a kind of a silly film like Monty Python, and kind of like that sort of visual imagery. But, there are these ideas, sometimes I think caricatures of the liturgy during that time period. And so you have a chapter in the book, The Later Middle Ages, All Decay and Decline. Some of this will be new to our listeners. Could you talk about, so this is kind of, I guess, like a common idea in scholarly circles that period was mostly characterized by decline. You say all decay and decline ? What's the standard narrative, and how do you challenge that a bit in your book?
Actually, this book that's just come out is the short version of a longer monograph I published 2 years ago. There's a study called The Roman Mass, which is much longer, but only covers the period up to the Council of Trent. And hopefully at some point I will write volume number 2, but that will certainly take some years. And so there I discuss these periods in much greater detail, and I'm pleased to say that the chapter on the late medieval period has been commented on very favorably by reviewers. Now, the standard narrative is that the later Middle Ages was a period of decline and decay, also of religious decline, and the disintegration of medieval society, as a way of almost necessarily leading to the Protestant Reformation. And liturgical scholars have had nothing good to say about that period, really. The Mass was seen as very much a clerical and exclusively clerical action in a language people wouldn't understand, Latin, with lots of physical separation between clergy and laity, and that really the laity were very detached from what was going on at the altar and occupied themselves with their own devotions, a lot of visual devotions. There was a great focus on seeing the host also as a substitute for actually receiving communion, because communion was a very rare event in any Christian life at the time. So that's kind of the standard narrative. And quite a few scholars have challenged that, and I try to weave that together in my chapter on the late medieval period. And I try to show that, yes, there were problems, there were perhaps difficulties, and it is true that the Latin language made the liturgical action more remote from the people, but that doesn't mean that at all that they were completely separated from it. Most people went to Mass very regularly and were actually quite familiar with it. They wouldn't have been able to, say, translate a Latin prayer correctly into their own vernacular language, but they basically understood where the Mass was. They would recognize Sanctus. They certainly had, then as printing was invented and books became much cheaper, they had their devotional books, which commented on the Mass, gave sort of reflections on what was happening at different parts of the liturgical celebration. And they were actually much more involved than we tend to think. But their involvement was unscripted. It was not regulated by the liturgical books, which were concerned with what the clergy should be doing at different points. So it's much more difficult for us to grasp how people actually participated. Their senses were involved. Of course, they were looking at, say, the altar, they were looking at the consecrated host, at the many images, but in that way they were actually able to participate in the mystery of the Eucharist, because there was the music, the sung parish Mass was the norm. There were other sensory elements, including smell and incense. There were rites that very much expressed the community function of the Mass, the exchange of the pax, of the peace, by means of the pax or pax sprit, as a tablet you would kiss and then pass on to your neighbor, exchanging the peace, the holy bread or holy loaf, which was shared after the Mass in the same way as in Orthodox churches today. Still, you share the blessed bread. So there were all kinds of rites that expressed that community building aspect of the Mass, and so it's fair to say that the liturgical life of the Church was more lively and more connected with the people than is often claimed.
Well, Father, this makes me think too. To bridge what you just said about misunderstandings about the High Middle Ages, and a comment that you made in the last segment. It sometimes can seem hard for people to grasp how things change over time. So for instance, you said the participation of the laity wasn't scripted, or if you look at how these sort of changes work, it's not that they were necessarily formal decisions that were sort of laid out, in a spreadsheet beforehand and then everybody decided. It seems to me that a lot of this is much more like how languages change throughout time. And so whatever else organic development of the Mass means, I think of something that Father Hunwick, God rest his soul, said that like the difference between like organic development of the Mass is that you could keep the same missal and sort of like cross stuff out or add pages, but if you had to buy a new book every 5 years, there was something less organic about that. That seems to me about how languages change over the time, in a similar way. And I wonder if that's maybe when it comes to writing the history of something like the Roman Mass, that's hard for people to grasp. Is any one time you put, like to the Newman point, right? Anytime you put your finger in that stream, you're going to be able to catch it, depending where you are, at sort of very different points, but that doesn't mean that it didn't have a sort of logic that made it all stick together. So again, like languages, that you might in a mere 50 years, if you move from one part of a continent to another, the dialects might not be able to understand each other, but that doesn't mean that there's not something real connecting all of those. Is that something that you find in teaching about the Mass and its history sometimes hard for people to grasp, that there's a logic, but it's not the sort of type of logic or organization they're expecting?
Yes, I think that's fair to say. I mean, our modern period really has seen advances in communication and in administration that would have been unthinkable in any historical period. So, and this affects also our understanding of, liturgical change. I mean, it would have been unthinkable in the medieval period for even a pope to make certain decisions and then expect them to be implemented, even within a number of years, because there was no way of communicating this, let alone administering such changes. So any change, any modification, by necessity, happened more organically. And the point about sort of changing liturgical books by perhaps adding something, crossing something out, is also a good point. Books are very expensive. Manuscripts were very expensive to produce and were a treasure and had to be used and reused. And yes, indeed, you make changes by adding things, by crossing things out, but you wouldn't just have a new missal manuscript commissioned every 5 years or something like that. So these different material conditions also affected the way things developed. And I think that is sometimes difficult for us today to imagine. Here we really need a certain historical imagination. It is true that at certain points decisions were made and they were carried out as best as they could be carried out by means of synods, episcopal decrees, and so. But the degree to which they really reached some remote priest in a chapel on a rural estate, completely different question.
So, Father, kind of zooming ahead in history, we get to the middle part of the 20th century, the time after the Second Vatican Council, and some major changes happened to the way the Roman Mass is celebrated during that period. Could you talk some about what were the ideas fueling those changes, and what are the major differences that people experience, like sort of post-liturgical reform, thinking specifically of the 20th century and the changes that were made?
I mean, if you look at Sacrosanctum Concilium Vatican II's constitution on the sacred liturgy, the guiding principle of reform is really active participation. So the people should participate fully, consciously, and actively in liturgical celebrations. This idea wasn't new. It was certainly formulated by Pope Pius X in his great document on church music, sacred music, Tra le sollecitudini, written in Italian in 1903. There, he called for active participation of the people in the liturgy. By that, he meant singing above all, so Gregorian chant. The people should actually know some basic Gregorian Mass and so on. And that it really was felt that the people needed to be led to that, to a kind of more conscious and active involvement in the Mass. Now, a lot of ink has been spilled on the interpretation of that principle. And at the Council, it seems pretty clear that priority was given to sort of interior participation, that this was not meant to be confused with activism, with doing things all the time, but that it should be a kind of active interior participation, which then expresses itself also. Making responses, singing, gestures, being really participant in the ritual action. And it was that principle that really guided then the practical reforms that were implemented as soon as the Sacrosanctum Concilium was promulgated in 1963. And that led to a number of changes which were spread very fast and weren't necessarily were not in Sacrosanctum Concilium, were at least not explicit. For example, I mean, the United States is a good example because changes were implemented in 1964 very abruptly, very rapidly, and they involved a large use of English in the Mass and altars facing people. And there wasn't any preparation. There weren't sort of seminars and podcasts and whatever you had when the revised English translation was introduced in 2011. It just happened, and that was a real rupture in the liturgical life of the church. And then more changes followed, especially then also a quite significantly reworked Missal in 1969, 1970. So the shape of the Mass certainly changed quite significantly. And that has had an effect on how people experienced. I think it's fair to say that that sacred character which people experienced before was not so clear anymore. I mean, it could still be a very sacred, prayerful, recollective celebration, but not quite to the same degree as the historical, the traditional Roman Rite. And since then, there have been various movements really in recovery of that sacredness of the liturgical tradition by various avenues, really. I mean, the recovery of the pre-Vatican II liturgical books, a so-called reform of the reform, sort of restoring the traditional elements to the post-conciliar rites. And that is very much a discussion that's ongoing.
Father, when I think of Marshall McLuhan pointing out about how the medium in which we communicate really has a powerful effect of things, I'm stringing together multiple things you've said now. So, for instance, the idea that a pope in response to the Protestant Reformation could say, we're now going to standardize the Mass and everybody is going to do the same one. As you pointed out, impossible without the printing press. When the printing press comes around, you can imagine something like a centralized liturgy. Okay, well, fast forward now to this area that you're talking about, the post-conciliar area. Okay, let's not make Latin prominent anymore. Well, that seems to be easy enough for us because we're like, oh, well, if vernacular senses change, we'll just reprint things. Why do we do Latin through most of the history of the West? Well, because vernacular languages change all the time. It's actually good to have a language like Latin that is not spoken all the time, by which you can be assured that the liturgical language will carry through, because like you said, you can't reprint things every 5, 20, 50 years without it being at great cost. But what people don't understand is even though we could, you could reprint a missal essentially every year. I mean, like they do that with daily missals, and all I ever can see is just loads of trees being carted off just to do the daily missal. But this gets at this fact that humans crave stability, especially when it matters most. And so it's not that like Latin is just hoity-toity or it's like the language of the higher ups. There is something to say, man, it's really nice to know that like a liturgical language changes extremely slowly rather than just with the times. And so again, it's like when we start to look at like these sort of difficulties and exactly what you were talking about with like the reform of the reform, I feel the best way to talk about the reform of the reform is not just people, some people prefer older stuff and some people prefer newer ones. It was in a way that if we let the mediums of communication, which are super fast now, get ahead of ourselves, it's important for the church to be exactly the group that says, let's stop and realize that continuity is important, change and growth is good too, but of a certain type, at a certain pace. I think that might be one way. When people ask me about what seems liturgically confusing, I try to say, let's not think about it in terms of preference. Let's think about it in terms of, like you said, people say organic, but another way to say that is living, right? We believe this is a living thing. And so, yes, living things grow and change, but they have continuity as well. And that might be one way to think about that.
I agree, and I would add another argument in favor of Latin. It's the global mobility we have today. People move constantly from country to country, from place to place, and it's somewhat ironic that at a time when, let's say many people never left their village or the immediate area where they lived, because there was mobility, some quite significant, especially in the Middle Ages. But most people actually wouldn't actually move very far throughout their lives, and that was the time when the Mass was in Latin. Now, where people have this tremendous mobility, Latin is actually quite a rare thing, and that actually offers severe limits to the people's participation. Okay, if I go to France, okay, I can still understand. If I go to Italy, if I go to Croatia, I can follow the Mass. Let alone countries that are further afield. So Latin is actually in this global village, in this highly mobile world, a very good way of giving people access to the rites they know, and making them capable of participating in the liturgy. So it has a unifying force, which in our world seems more advantageous than ever.
Well, Father, you've given us a number of fascinating things to chew on. We're really grateful to have you on the show this week. Folks, I encourage you, if you're still Christmas shopping or anything, go find A Short History of the Roman Mass by Father Uwe Michael Lang. It's published by Ignatius Press, but I'll talk to Divine Treasures, where my daughter works, to make sure that they have it on their shelves. Father, thank you again. Blessings. Please be assured of our prayers, okay?
Thank you so much. I'll be sure of my prayers for you too. God bless.
This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Budmar. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Budmar joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Bud, wonderful as usual. Let's be honest here. Sometimes you can have guests that were not made for radio. That's the one way to put it. What I love is when we have a guest that by the end, you just wish that we actually had more time to talk about. I know we say this all the time, but I have to be honest. I literally had questions that I just had to crumple up the page and throw it into the trash can because we just didn't have enough time to really get into it. Especially that second segment, I really thought we got into some really interesting detail.
Yeah, so I've always been kind of swayed by the English accent. I've always thought if I had an English accent, people would think I'm more sophisticated than I am.
Nice.
But I feel like Father upped the level of culture and sophistication on the show. Midway through the interview, I thought we really should have prepared teas and crumpets for this conversation.
Hey, wait, real quick. Have you ever had crumpets?
I don't even know what they are.
Crumpets are like better pancakes. I know. I should,
This reminds me of
I'm
that.
part Welsh, I'm a Norman invader, all this stuff. I shouldn't be praising anything English, although crumpets might have came from Wales. Dude, we should have a crumpet party, Bonner Mar, because the crumpets are awesome. I'm sorry. Just telling the truth.
Yeah, that does sound amazing. It kind of reminds when you asked me about crumpets, it reminded me of that Talladega Nights scene where the French race car driver is trying to get him to say, "I love crepes," and he feels like it's very un-American to do so. But
I do love crepes too.
They're like those little pancakes. The Brits have some interesting, I don't know. I always thought truffles were sort of like a meat delicatessen, but it's chocolate, right?
We'll have to have a whole episode on that one. Let's get to how people can be more involved in our prayer life.
Well, it's interesting because I've been, if you've noticed the last few episodes, kind of jumping around and trying to figure out the schedule for the Rosary. But I bumped into Matt Wilkham recently, and he was telling me we're going back to sort of like the old standard times for the Rosary.
We're so back.
6 a.m., 10 a.m., 8:30 p.m. Matt was excited because 6 a.m. it's the Word on Fire Rosary now, so it's Bishop Barron.
Nice.
8:30 it's Father Groeschel. And then at 2:57 it's the Chaplet of Divine Mercy. But you can also use the app to pray the Rosary anytime, anywhere.
Wonderful. And also, speaking of new stuff, again, I think we brought this up, but the website's new. It's very slick. If you go to iowacatholicradio.com and go to the events page, not only can you see sort of an overview of the year, for instance, 2024, but you can actually, they have what's going on and then a drop-down menu that really explains what is happening. So, for instance, in March of next year, we kind of have a little bit of a break. Makes sense, Christmas, New Year, everything like that. So in March, we have Scott Hahn coming to West Des Moines over at St. Francis of Assisi. This is March 1st. Also, the Forge Conference, and if I'm not mistaken, I think those are interrelated. Am I right about this? Yes.
They might be.
No, they're not.
Oh,
They just happen to be
I could totally see Han at the Forge Conference, but I should give an extra shout out for the Forge Conference because I bumped into John Bishop at St. Augustine's. He's like, promote the Forge Conference on the radio. So supposedly it's supposed to be pretty great.
Speakers include Matt Burke. Oh, Father Boniface Hicks. That's really cool. John Bishop himself. And speaking of bishops, Bishop William Johnson. And then I think I've heard of this guy. John Leonetti will be there as well. So you guys want to make sure to go check that out. And then, of course, the big event coming in 2025, April 2nd, we have an evening with Father Mike Schmitz. This is going to be the big event for Iowa Catholic Radio. So you need to make sure to mark that down so that you can be a part of that big kickoff for hopefully a lot of new energy that's coming from that. We yapped on, so Bud, great show as always. And if folks want to make sure to donate to Iowa Catholic Radio, they can do so by going to iowacatholicradio.com or 515-223-1150. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.